Hi again then guys, and welcome to a kind of video which we don't cover all that often on the channel, and that's not rallying in particular, but rather an overall game review. We occasionally do those. It tends to be more series based stuff rather than looking at a whole game in one video though, but I always enjoy doing these because it is fun to condense an entire game down and my thoughts about an entire game into one video. It's kind of a fun little challenge to do. So for this one, I'd like to first thank the people behind the game for providing me with an early access code for it. Of course, the game in question is VRally 4, so that I could check out the game before release this video after the embargo, which is today, and then of course give you guys an informed choice as to whether or not you are interested in playing the game, which, if you're watching this on the day of release, the 6th, you'll be able to buy it on console tomorrow, the 7th. Then later on PC, and I believe they're planning to also release it on the Switch as well, the Nintendo Switch. So for those who are considering buying it, what do you need to know? Well, the first thing that you need to know could be considered to be a downside for some reviewers, and that is I have honestly never played a V-Rally game before. And for many of you guys, that probably sounds like a really weird thing, especially if you've followed this channel for some time, because you know how many different games I cover, particularly racing games, rally games, motorbike games, that kind of stuff. But of course, for as many as I've played, there are plenty more that I haven't, and this just so happens to be one of those. Now, you could consider that to be, of course, a disadvantage, because how can you know how good the fourth one is if you haven't played the first, second and third? How can you know what changes have been made? That's a fair point, but the thing is, most reviewers will have played the other ones, so to have the perspective of someone who is not affected by the nostalgia of the franchise, who can come in without knowing what's been changed for the better or for the worse, and just having it as a completely fresh perspective, can sometimes be just as beneficial when it comes to a review. And that is the position that I'm in, because even though I've never played the games before, I am familiar with the franchise, and I am a big rally fan, because I played a number of them, especially in the early to mid 2000s, the WRC games, the Colin McRae games, and of course rallying is not as dominant now on the market as it was, especially what we would have considered to be sims back then. Even something like Gran Turismo featured a lot of rally cars and a lot of rallying, but then it kind of went away, especially in GT6, and now Gran Turismo is starting to come back to it. Something like Forza, for instance, the massive juggernaut, barely has any rallying at all. There's a few rally cars in motorsport games, but that's about it, and the Forza games don't really feature any kind of official rallying. There's some off-roading, but not proper rallying. So stuff like Colin McRae, which of course became Dirt over the years, the WRC games, which are still around, but they're not quite as loved from what I've seen. I certainly don't really play them anymore. So the market is fresh for something like a really good rally game, because the big dogs like Assetto Corsa, Gran Turismo, Forza, Project Cars, and even some others too, they're kind of leaving that part of the market wide open for the picking. And that's where V-Rally 4 and other games like it come in. Now, to show my hand relatively early on in the review, I will say that there is one particular group of gamers who will definitely want to check this game out if you get the chance, and that is my group, what I would consider myself to be, and that is someone who really loved the retro, you could say, but early 2000s to slightly later 2000s rally games on stuff like the original Xbox, the GameCube, the PS2, like the ones that I mentioned, your Colin McRae's, the WRCs, and even the previous V-Rally games themselves. Those games which are more realistic than your average arcade, but they're not necessarily trying to be a full sim. And I've always loved that middle ground. That's why I actually love Gran Turismo and Forza so much, because although technically they're kind of sims, they're also not, but they are a step above arcade. That's what those rally games felt like as well, and I would say that that covers this one also. It's not trying to be real life, but it's definitely more realistic than a full-on arcade game. So with that in mind, let's move naturally, of course, onto the physics, because it's the physics that will dictate the kind of player, more often than not, who will enjoy the game the most, more so than the car selection, the racing, the graphics even, although of course that tends to be the first thing that we notice. So what are the physics like? Well, I will be, of course, completely honest and say that I don't love the physics in this game. I think that the physics do it justice, for sure. It's a very clearly retro game. It is appealing to the kind of players who do miss those earlier 2000s titles, but at the same time, it feels a bit jarring to go, as I do, from Gran Turismo and Forza to suddenly playing something like this. You can feel the difference, for sure. The cars feel a little inconsistent, if I'm honest. Even something like what I bought as my first car in the game, the classic Mini, I bought that one because although I knew it had less power than some of the other options, that it should be one of the best handling cars in the game, because after all that's what made the Mini so good in actual classic rallying, even against stuff like Alpines and various others, of course, from its era. But then when I actually got into the Mini, after driving a couple of other cars like the Volkswagen Polo that you start the game with as a test, a Ford Focus rallycross car which was very fun and engaging, then driving the Mini, it felt kind of weird, because for one thing it's way more tail happy than it should be for a front wheel drive car, but also the physics are a little inconsistent. You can definitely get a feel for what the game's going for, but for me, I don't love the physics themselves as much as I wanted to. And to be honest, that's not entirely the fault of the physics themselves, because part of what I mean is the game very early on has a sudden change of difficulty, and I'm sure some of you guys who do play it will notice this as well, where your first driving test in the Volkswagen Polo, you get a feeling for what the game's going to be like, and I really enjoyed that first test. Then, when I drove the Ford Focus in a rallycross event, I thoroughly enjoyed that as well. I had it on 75% opponent difficulty just to see what it would be like, and I destroyed them. Like a 10-second victory, something like that on a really short circuit. I really enjoyed that as well. And that is kind of why it felt so jarring to me when I jumped into the Mini, because then the Mini, which I expected to be the best experience of them all, suddenly felt really weird, more challenging than a Mini should be, more aggressive than a Mini should be, and kind of more unruly than a car of its size and weight ever should be. So for me there's a little bit of inconsistency there as far as the physics go. Maybe they kind of nerfed the car, and it's not necessarily just the Mini, because also in this video you'll see me driving an extreme hill climb car, a black one. It looks like a Pikes Peak style machine, and it's one which you would fully expect to be raw, extremely fast, and kind of the most challenging in the game, and it would be justified in being such because it's so quick. And yet you drive it, and as you can kind of tell in the video, it's way too good. And that sounds like a good thing, but it's kind of not, because it almost feels like you're not needed as a driver. The handling is so good that you feel like you can just accelerate and let the car do the rest. It's that good. You barely have to turn, barely have to brake. It just sticks like it's on rails. That sounds cool on paper, but when you actually play the game and experience what I mean, I think you'll see the downside. It's not so much that I dislike the physics. In fact, I don't dislike the physics at all. It's just that they're a little bit inconsistent, because stuff like the Polo and the Focus, the newer ones, feel pretty good. They feel like you arguably would want them to. Then the Mini, though, feels way off, and then something like a hill climb car feels way too good. So if you stick to the newer vehicles, I think you'll be pretty happy, but apparently Super Extreme and Classics fall the either end of the spectrum, or at least from my experience in the game so far. As far as the graphics go, I think that the graphics are probably a very deliberate choice on the part of the makers, because it definitely doesn't look like a game that's going to rival Gran Turismo or Forza or Project Cars or anything like that anytime soon, but again, it's not trying to, so of course not. It's more of an arcade-esque rally game, so it's not trying to be a top-tier title when it comes to realism. The downside of that logic, though, is that unfortunately many people, especially younger players, are playing those very stunning looking games. So regardless of if you're a retro fan or not, it's still jarring to go from one to the other, where this game still looks like a late 2000s game. Now it actually doesn't, but I think you know what I mean. If you put something from the late 2000s next to this will look better. But it doesn't seem to look better when you're actually looking at the screen, if you know what I mean. Things are a little bit too rounded, the details are sometimes a little bit too sharp or not sharp enough, colours maybe pop a little bit too much. Not to the point of being cartoonish, it's no road trip adventure, that's for sure, but it's, as I said, a little bit jarring after playing some of the others. Now, as far as the rest of the game, stuff like the sounds, the career mode, that kind of stuff, well, for that I think well, to speak first of all about the sounds in particular, the sounds are adequate, I would say. They're not anything that's going to blow your mind, but they're not under par either. They are basically what you'd expect. The cars sound decent enough, you've got the sound of the gravel and the stones hitting the metal bodywork of the car, the tyres, all the kind of expected sounds, water splash, your co-driver. And I will say that I like the level of depth that the settings of the game go into in terms of changing the driver's volume, or the co-driver's volume I should say, his accent, and that kind of stuff is cool. You can personalise the game more, you can change the level of motion blur, the, of course, stuff that's shown on screen, the camera, the way it follows, how close it is, how far it is, and all of that personalisation is of course what people want nowadays. But more so from a sim, usually, so to see it in a game like this is pretty cool, because having more personalisation will allow a lot of people to enjoy it that much more. And as far as the vehicle selection, well, of course I haven't gone all the way through the game, but you can see probably enough of the game in this video in terms of the car selection to get a good feeling of what you can expect. You've got some Pikes Peak style hill climb cars, there are some buggies which I haven't unlocked yet in the game, or at least I haven't driven them in quick mode. You've got WRC style machines, classic rally cars, rallycross style cars, so there's a good selection to go for. So if you're looking for the kind of car collection that I would always want from a game, you're definitely covered there. Because again, in the earlier 2000s, we certainly did not have that. Stuff like Colin McRae and WRC would always go for just the WRC cars and very rarely stray away from that. And when they did, it would tend to be stuff that you had to unlock, like a transit van rally car, or an extreme evolution rally car that didn't actually exist in the WRC games, that kind of thing. Maybe the occasional old school car, like an Escort or something. So in terms of the car selection, if you're maybe a slightly older gamer, and I would include even myself in that, like in your 20s or more, where you are old enough to experience those older 2000s games and remember what it was like back then I think you'll really appreciate this one more when it comes to the selection of tracks, locations, vehicles, options in the menu even is way more in depth than it ever was, but still with that authentic feeling from the earlier 2000s. So if you are a retro fan, if you want to kind of time warp back to the earlier 2000s and get that kind of vibe back to your rally game, this definitely delivers. If that appeals to you, then definitely check out V-Rally 4, because that is what it's very clearly all about, appealing to that denomination of the gaming audience. If, however, you're someone who is not a real big fan of the earlier 2000s rally titles, then perhaps not, because you probably won't fully appreciate what this game is going for, and you'll probably only notice more of the downsides. If someone like me who does love those still sees the downsides, then somebody who hasn't played those older ones will probably see them even more, and they'll stand out even more. So overall, my thoughts for V-Rally 4 are just that. If you love retro rallying, then check it out. If you're looking for the latest and greatest in racing or rally simulation, perhaps give it a pass. It really does depend on what kind of gamer you are. So once again, thanks to the people behind the game itself for letting me check out the game a little bit early, and I look forward to working with them again in the future. But that's it for this review overall. Of course, stick around on the channel for more like this, and for now, as always, thanks for watching.